We live in a world that feels more connected than ever. I regularly talk to friends that I have across the world and in other parts of our own country. Neighbor is a strange word these days because it always meant just the people that were nearest to us. And it can be those people. But of course, many Christians, and beginning with Jesus, interpreted this more broadly, especially for Jesus, in the sense that a neighbor wasn't simply someone that you liked and agreed with. And with our world of social media, even though we are connected, it turns out that our neighborhood then has grown. And our neighbors are all over the world. They're not just those that are close to us. The internet has brought us into contact with people of all kinds, some of them very different than us. And so, to ponder loving our neighbor, as the book that we read this morning reminds us, is a big task. The little girl in it says, how am I supposed to love all of those people? My daughter doesn't seem to have a problem loving her neighbor. Maybe it's the superpower of a 2-year-old. She just makes neighbors everywhere she goes. She literally knows our neighbors next door to us. But then, this last week, as you know, I was on vacation with my family. We were in a park, and Maxine just decided to walk up to a teenager that was playing volleyball, grabbed her hand, and we need to talk with Maxine about the fact that you can't just go up to someone. Luckily, it worked out, though. This teenager said, I have lots of little cousins, it's okay. Maxine took her from her volleyball game and led her away to the nearby swings and asked her to push, even though her parents were standing right there. On vacation, we actually met several neighbors. There was another little boy who was playing in the sand dunes because we went to Empire, Michigan. And he had a digger, and Maxine is fascinated with machinery right now, so she had to go play with him and his digger, show her the smaller digger that she was carrying with her. And at one stop, she made an entire busload of friends. They were on a tour bus, disembarking to take a look at the dunes from a lookout. And Maxine wanted to greet each and every one of them. She has no problem making neighbors and knowing how to love them because Maxine doesn't care whether they are different than her or not. We often try to explain to her that an older child may not be interested in playing with her because she's so little, but she doesn't care. She just wants to meet and love new people. But I think more of us are like the little girl in the book today. Maybe I can love my neighbor too. It's our final book in this series, Jesus Loves the Little Children. We decided to start the school year appealing back to our childlike nature, knowing that Jesus commands us to have the faith of a child. This little girl struggles to understand two things. First, she sees this new building being built in her neighborhood, and she asks her mother, are these my neighbors too? And the second question, then how do I love my neighbor if they indeed include all the people in all these buildings, and as her mother tells her, other people as well? Well, her mother responds with a simple phrase. She says, you start by noticing. So you should hopefully have a sheet with you, and you're supposed to fill it out each week during this series. It's school. We're back to school. If you didn't bring a pen with you, this is the 4th week. And if you're not prepared by now, you're probably not going to get a very good grade. Start by noticing. She says, I'm sure you can figure it out. You just have to start by noticing. And what she invites her daughter to do is to notice what other people do to show love. And that's a great way to answer this question, how do I love my neighbor? But it's also important not only to observe other people showing love, but I believe that this is the place we have to start in order to love our neighbors. We have to be able to notice people around us and people in need. I don't know about you, but I am so frequently too busy with my own tasks or looking at other things that I don't always notice my neighbor. I did happen to run to the hardware store this week, and as I was going into the store, I noticed a man who had purchased a long box, trying to struggle to get it off of the cart that he was using into the back of his truck. And I stopped and said, do you want me to help you put that in the back of your truck? He said, that would be great. I actually have a broken foot right now, and I'm really struggling with this. So it was a time when I did notice, but I'm not always that good at it. But the first thing I think we need to do, even though this little girl's mom says you need to notice how others love, that is a good way to learn how to love. But before we can even learn how to love, we have to first see that there are people that need our love. We have to notice. We have to start by noticing that there are people that need our love. And then we need to realize that it's not simply good enough to notice. I do that a lot of times as well. I don't know about you. I end up being like the people in the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus tells that we're so familiar with, where they end up passing by when they see the person. I see people in need, but I pass by. And so we can't just notice. That's the important place to start. We start by noticing, but we must also act. I managed to do that at the hardware store the other day, but as I have already said, too frequently I notice but don't do anything. I don't act, and we must. That is the entire point of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, that there are two people that notice but walk by, but it is the third person coming by who notices and acts. I overheard someone recently saying they wondered how so-and-so was doing. They're a homebound person. They said, someone told me I should just stop by, but I can't do that. Yes, you can. That's the very thing that we should do as a Christian, and to love our neighbor. Just stop by. If you've noticed that you haven't seen them in a while, if you wonder how they are doing, just stop by. It's the act that we have to take. We can't just notice that they haven't been around, or notice that we've heard they maybe haven't been doing very well, but not take the action. And not only can we act and can we love our neighbors, that's this wonderful piece of this title of this book, Maybe I Can Love My Neighbor Too. Not only can we, but we have to. We must. Jesus says that everything hangs on these two things in this scripture that we read this morning. He says all of the law and the prophets. That means everything that is good about our religion for him. All of it hangs on these two things. And so we must love God, and we must love our neighbor. It's not a maybe kind of thing for us. And of course, that's what this little girl discovers, that indeed it's not maybe, but that it is indeed possible. We must love our neighbors. These two things, love God and love your neighbors, are uniquely tied together because in the very act of loving other people, we are loving God who made us and those other people. That's the beauty of this thing. It's not actually two commandments. And that's what Jesus knows because, of course, you might sort of wonder, they come and ask him, what is the greatest commandment? And he gives two. But the reality is that they are a single commandment. We are to love God. And in the very act of loving our neighbors, we do love God. But Jesus sees that it has to be a holistic thing. It cannot simply be that you're the type of person who says, oh, I love God, and yet you constantly disregard your neighbor. You have to instead love others to truly show your love of God. This understanding, I think, is needed now more than ever. We have to understand that we are called to love our neighbor. We do really well at loving those people that love us back, that are part of our tribe, but we're not just called to love those that love us, but we're called to love our neighbor. And in this sense, I think it's very interesting because this is changing over time, and it's important. It used to be that our neighbor was just that person next door to us, but our neighbors are such a vast group of people these days because of how connected we are. And because, as Jesus challenges us, we need to love not only those that are like us, but those that are different than us. We are so good at loving our family and our friends. And it is true that loving our neighbor can be much harder. I've seen the way neighbors can be. I luckily have a good relationship with my neighbors, but I have family members that have neighbors that they had a hard time getting along with because they kept their grass immaculate and they edged things, and they were so angry at my family members because they left sort of a slovenly yard, shall we call it, by which I mean they mowed it regularly but did nothing else. We may dislike our neighbor because they have a dog that barks at all hours, or maybe they put signs up in their yard that we disagree with. It can be hard to love our neighbor. But it doesn't change the fact that Jesus commands us to love our neighbor. And again, the biggest thing and the hardest thing perhaps for us to wrap our minds around and for this little girl to realize is that our neighbors can be next door or far, far away. That's what her mom says to her when she asks, are the people in this new building my neighbors as well? She says, yeah. Not only are your neighbors next door, but they're across the street and they can be far, far away. And this is important for us to understand, both physically and ideologically. Our neighbors can be close by us physically. They also can be far, far away. We're discovering that, I think, right now as we face the fact that there are Afghani refugees needing a place to go. And the question is, how do we as a country respond? And how do we as Christians respond to that reality? Will we love that neighbor as well who is far, far away from us, wanting to come closer? But perhaps we struggle more so with the ideologies. Those neighbors that are close to us ideologically, that's easy to deal with, but those that are different from us ideologically, we struggle so. And yet this challenge remains. Jesus doesn't say, love God and love those that love you. He says, love your neighbor. And then describes the neighbor on multiple occasions as either an enemy or those that are the poorest among us. And this little girl in this book is challenged by this, and we are too. But again, Jesus couldn't speak more strongly about this. Later in Matthew, he will say, anytime you do something for the least of these, you've done it for me. And he says this in the sense of an end time when we are divided out by who was faithful and who was not. And he says, if you don't love your neighbor, he doesn't say it in those words there. What he says is, if you don't help those that are hungry and hurting and poor, then you haven't been faithful. But anytime you do it for the least of these, you do it for me. I think it is another way that he defines neighbor in that place. The neighbor is those who need our help, perhaps because they cannot help themselves. The book today calls us to care for those that have suffered. There's one instance where the mother gives some money to someone to help. And what they say is people that were displaced from their homes. We don't know why, but it could be because of a refugee issue. It may be because of abuse. Regardless, the mother feels that those are her neighbors as well, and we are to see that too. But if we start by noticing, then the final question would be, if we embrace this idea that, yes, Jesus commands us to love our neighbors, then what do we do? Well, we need to make intentional acts of love. And so we can be on the lookout for ways to help. That's what this little girl discovers first. There's the workman that helps someone as their cart is tipping over. We can help someone that is just stopping by, but is perhaps struggling. She talks about opening doors or helping with groceries. We can help older folk, is what they say. I apologize to all of you if you feel, it's a children's book. But here's the reality. You may be thinking, I am older folk. But if you're in your 80s and there's someone in their 90s, then they're the older folk. And you can still help them. She says you can share. She talks specifically about toys, but we are called to share all kinds of things that we have, and that's a way to love our neighbors. We can bake something and share good things to eat, she says. This is one of my favorite ways to be a neighbor. You can give something to someone that needs it more than you. You can use what you're strong in to help someone else. That's what she says. I can lift groceries because I'm strong, and she reveals her muscles. But that can mean all manner of things. If you are a strong person of prayer, you can pray for your neighbors. If you are a person that knows how to do a certain skill or task, you can do that for your neighbors. I heard just this week about neighbors mowing others' neighbors' lawns, and maybe that's what that cranky neighbor should have done for my family member. If they wanted the lawn edged, they could have taken a quick moment to edge their neighbor's lawn for them. My brother has a neighbor that had done this, and they just moved, and he's now sad because they said, you have such a small lawn. When I mow my lawn, I'm just going to mow your lawn. You have such a small driveway. When I plow my driveway, I'm just going to plow yours as well. He loved it. It was an act of love from his neighbor. And they just moved, and he says, now I have to mow and plow my own driveway. Those are the kinds of things we could do just to show a little love. You can check on your neighbor, and you can stop by, please. I know that we sometimes feel like we have to call or we have to make a plan, but you'd be surprised that sometimes people love it if you just stop by. Every person in the whole wide world is our neighbor. And so we have to act not only in these little ways with the people close to us, but in bigger ways as well. And so it may involve calling your congresspeople or giving to international organizations that support the work around the world to bring love to people. And then I ran across one other thing that I really love this week because I do think we struggle, and I know that Pastor Mike talked about this last week as well, the fact that people who are very different from us, I sometimes feel like a broken record, but it is a problem for us, right? It's a deep spiritual issue for our culture right now that we are so divided. I ran across some words from John Wesley, so this is old stuff because remember, he lived in the 18th century, but he was the founder of our movement. And even then, it's not like our division is new. He said, it is hard to love people who are different than us. And he said this, what you do is make sure that you don't think or speak evil of them. You pray for them. You encourage them to do good. And you find ways to collaborate with them in ministry. I think that's really wonderful. We instead try to find ways that we can cut down our enemies or thwart them, but instead to focus on not thinking or speaking bad about them, to pray for them, to encourage them, and to collaborate with them in the places that we can. would be a wonderful way to love our neighbor. I know that we can love our neighbors too. We started this series by talking about how we are all God's children. And a couple of weeks ago, I told you that sharing was an act of love. And last week, you heard about how God gave us love and that we are to share that love again. And this challenge throughout this series has been all about how we can love others. But today, I want you to specifically know that we are called to love our neighbor. I could preach this challenge every single Sunday, and we would still need to hear it because we struggle so much to truly love those who are hard to love, because we're always looking for a way out. This little girl, I think, wanted her mom to say, oh, no, that new building? No, they're not our neighbors. It's only the people that are already here, right? But Jesus, when asked, what is the one most important commandment? That you love God, and by extension, that you love your neighbor. We can't weasel our way out of this. So I know that we can love our neighbors too. It's not a maybe. I know that we can. We just have to notice and act. And so I put one final phrase on your sheet, but it's your homework. I want you to think today about how you can love your neighbor and then fill in that blank. This week I'm going to do something. I don't know what it is. God will speak to you and put it on your heart, and then do it. We can love our neighbors. Amen.